thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me here. It's um, really nice to talk to you all. So yeah, I'm a postdoc at the Center for Digital Narrative in Bergen now, but I Mytholudics started as my PhD dissertation when I was a PhD at the IT University of Copenhagen. Um, I defended that in 2022, so it's been a few years since then, but the book came out just last April. Actually, almost exactly a year ago now. Now that I think about it, almost exactly a year ago. So that's fun. Um, yeah, and after the dissertation, I rewrote it from scratch, basically, to make it a much more kind of cohesive as a book. Um, but yeah, um, so and also because my ideas developed since the dissertation as I was working in Bremen on my postdoc after that. Um, So I think there's two main ways that Mytholudics can be hopefully useful for you. The first and maybe foremost for us as academics is as an analytical framework. So mainly I developed Mytholudics as a way to use myth to understand how games produce meaning. That will hopefully make a bit more sense as we go. Um, Seeing some other researchers make use of this framework in the last couple of years has been really exciting and gratifying. And it shows that there's at least some evidence that this does work as a framework, not just my kind of idiosyncratic way of looking at things, which is what it started as. So I'm very happy for that. The second is as a design and particularly a world building tool, which so far is untested and unproven, but I would be thrilled if someone tried it. And the idea is that kind of like the notion of design pillars in games, Mytholudics could provide a way to provide some kinds of world building pillars. So things which underpin not specific events or stories or things in the world, but logics of how this world is meant to work. But yeah, we'll maybe that'll make sense as we go on. We'll see. So ever since people have been researching games, we've had a problem when it comes to what kind of thing a digital game even is. Is a game another kind of story? Is it an kind of interactive film? Is it something else altogether? Um, it can often be a rather tedious question because there is ultimately no final answer, of course. You can give any definition of what a game is, and it can have a million holes poked in it. But this is why I like the philosopher Yone Arioranta's approach to definitions. At least in our kind of fields, we never define something to capture reality per se, as he puts it here, but to understand it. Definitions are argumentative tools. It's a way of describing a thing that hopefully convinces you of something about it that I'm trying to persuade you of. Yeah, okay. So, but why is that important? So, I think myths and games are very similar in this regard because how you interpret them is very much shaped by what you understand them to be in the first place. So, the Finnish folklorist Frog makes this wonderful point that has lived rent-free in my mind since I first read it, is that when myths are defined as stories, we may see stories where there are none. And I think it's exactly the same case with digital games. If you think of a myth or a game as a story in the first place, then you will see stories. This leads us to certain problems. So for Frog in folklore and mythology, one problem it leads to is either ignoring crucial aspects of a culture because they're not story-based, or seeing characters, events, superstitions, taboos, and so on as just fragments of stories that are yet to be discovered. And he points out that sometimes there is no story to be found in the sense of a kind of developed full narrative, right? And this leads us to dismissing or downplaying really important evidence because the whole time we're looking past it for the story that it is supposedly a part of. That's not to say, of course, that stories are not vitally important, just that they aren't everything. And I think that this is an important thing to consider with games as well. Yeah, here's the wonkiness. I think I have to click. I think the arrow keys don't work on the web app. Okay. So a classic way to approach definitions of games and games as stories is the Tetris test. No one would dispute that Tetris is a game, but does it have a story? Is it a story? Some do actually make the argument that it does. They say that it tells a story of the American worker juggling an ever increasing number of responsibilities and pressures, becoming overwhelmed and inevitably ending in failure. I think it's kind of a fun interpretation, but at most, I think we're describing a metaphor here, not a story. If we use the word story to describe that, then I think the word doesn't really mean that much anymore, and it's not a very useful word for us. Um, but of course, you can get quite far looking at games as stories, and stories are, of course, undoubtedly important, like I say, but it can also lead us astray. So I think it's an approach that works really well for what we might call heavily narrative games, like The Last of Us or The Wolf Among Us, but not so well for a lot of other games. As the Doom developer John Carmack charmingly put it in 2004, story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. Obviously, that makes sense for Doom more so than most games, I think, but he has something of a point. There are plenty of games that I've played, enjoyed, and indeed found truly meaningful where I couldn't relay to you the basic plot. So basically, stories aren't the whole story. So here's how I do see games. Digital games, as we experience them, are pieces of software, right? Fundamentally. Within this software is a lot of things. Chiefly, we have a game world, which acts as this spatial nexus for everything that we do. We play the game, and in the game world, we encounter characters, we interact with its systems, we experience stories within it. We generally inhabit the world according to its rules. One very important difference between this and narratives for me is that a game world is comprised of both constative and performative elements, while a narrative is by and large a constative thing. What I mean by that is that a novel already has all the words written in the order that you're going to read them in. That's I'm speaking typically here. I know things like House of Leaves exist, and there are plenty of good counterexamples, but by and large, right? Um, Whereas a game has many elements that are like those words that will never change, right? You have the characters' dialogue scripts, you have the art, you have the assets and things like that. But in addition to that, you also have this systems that you can play with however you like. That's not pre-written. I can tell a story of what I did in this kind of in this marshland here, but afterwards, and that is a story, the telling of it. But in the moment of actual play, that's just me doing things in the system. And that's what I think digital games share with those other things that we call games, like a playground game of tag, right? There's no story there in any meaningful sense, but there are certain rules and systems and social relations that we buy into while we play. And a digital game world, I think, does that in a fictional and simulated world, which are both important terms we'll come back to. So that's how I understand games, right? Now, the question is, how do we interpret these things, these kind of software that contain game worlds in which I inhabit a world and I do things and I come away with feelings, hopefully. So as I've been hinting at, I think myth is a really good way to understand games because those two things share a lot in common. They're both comprised of many different things that are both performative and constative. In the case of myth, we're talking things like ritual and architecture and social relations and these kinds of things, right, that are not stories, but are an important part of myth in this sense. And that's because I use Frog's understanding of myth here, which I think is really potent. It's models of knowing the world and things in it. The important thing about thinking of myth as a model is that that has implications for both our interpretation of the world in terms of meaning and aesthetics and so on, but also our behavior, how we act within it. A model is something that can be used to make predictions. Very, very reduced example might be an ancient Greek sailor doing something that they believe will appease Poseidon in order to gain safe passage across the sea. That's not only a matter of having stories that are culturally important, it's a belief in how the world works and therefore how to act in it to gain certain outcomes. This, of course, has really important implications for games. Because we can see in games the influence that kind of traditional myth and folklore has on their world building and their stories and their characters and events. So here's, Kratos fighting Thor in God of War Ragnarok. We can talk about the myths of Victorian London, if you like, drawn on in games like Lies of P. For me, this is looking at games through myth. We use mythology as a lens through which to analyze the game. This is a really important step and really useful for us. It helps see where the developers get their influence from, how they play around with those influences, or maybe reinforce stereotypes, and so on. But I think that we should at the same time look at games as myth. And what I mean by that is that in addition to what we've just seen, so, we can analyze the depiction here of Victorian London and the kind of myths that it's drawing on, games are also spaces that we inhabit and act within. And for this, we need to understand a bit about virtuality or simulation. So a great way to understand this is through the example of doors. So Espen Aarseth uses doors to look at the different layers of fictionality in a game. So in general, we would say we have both real things and fictional things. This bottle is real. A bottle written about in a novel is fictional. But Aarseth says we have a category in between, which he calls the virtual. So this first door you can see here works just like we'd expect a door to, right? You can open it and close it, you can use it to block movement, and so on. But then this other door here doesn't do anything at all. Really, it's just a piece of wall painted to look like a door. And yet this first door still isn't a real door. The real door in this room behind me is a real door, right? It behaves in those ways too. It opens and closes here. But also, because it's real, I can knock on it to produce sound. I could swing it really quickly and hit someone with it. I could, maybe take it off and repurpose the materials, right? I can't do any of those things with this door in Half-Life here because it's a simulation of a door that only simulates a certain number of aspects of doorness, the opening and closing, but not everything else. So this occupies some space in between, which Aarseth calls the virtual. A more concrete example now of how this interacts with myth, because I think that games can force you to accept certain premises and do certain things and accept them as true in a different way to fiction. So that is, it can make you take on a certain model for understanding the world through its limited but kind of directed, or we might say opinionated simulation. So this is a screenshot from SimCity 2013. So, you're managing a virtual city and you're managing your budget, as you can see here. Part of playing SimCity and not going bankrupt is learning the rules and the principles behind its simulation of the city and the economy. One important thing you can learn about this particular simulation is that there is an optimal tax rate, and this is it. Players have discovered that the optimal tax rate in the game is 12% for people on low incomes, 11% for medium, and 10% for high incomes. So in the mechanics, this maximizes the happiness stat as well as the kind of income you get. If you put taxes lower, you don't really get any more happiness, but you do get a lot less money. If you put taxes higher, people get very unhappy very quickly and start to leave. We might recognize this idea in real life as the Laffer curve. This is the idea that increasing tax rate can actually decrease tax revenues above a certain point because wealthy people leave the country, tax evasion increases. So basically, there is an optimal tax rate somewhere between 0 and 100%, but not 0 or 100. Neoliberal politicians have often used this to argue that the tax rate should be lower than whatever it is now. So in real life, the Laffer curve is a theoretical concept, right? There's no way of ever running the counterfactual control scenarios that verify for sure whether X tax rate generates more revenue than Y. But in SimCity, the Laffer curve is made more true, more real, because it's coded into the game's simulation. It's in the very fabric of the game world on the same level as the laws of physics. Or in fact, SimCity doesn't really have physics to speak of, so it's more important than the laws of physics in that sense. When I play SimCity, I have to accept that is how the tax system works. Just as sitting here right now, I have to accept gravity. So in addition to looking at games through myth, when we look at games as myth, we're looking at the model for knowing the world and things in it that we as players are forced to accept and analyzing what kind of model that is. How does it make us behave and inhabit this world? So there we have those two views of games as myth and through myth. So games as myth is in some ways a kind of naive reading, right? It's taking the game world on its own terms and asking, how does it work? How do we need to behave within it? Games through myth is zooming out from that perspective and kind of looking past the game itself. So where does that model of understanding come from? In SimCity, we might see its roots in neoliberal economics, which makes a lot of sense considering the first game came out in mid-1980s USA. I couldn't find a better picture for this, so always go with the cat when in doubt. But the player is not just a passive receiver of that. We need to bring in the idea of play here and figure out what that does to this whole equation. And a place we can start to think of this is play as analogous to reading, right? We read a book, we play a game. Is that what's going on here? In that way, playing is a mode of interpretation. Um, this way of thinking usually comes across in frameworks like procedural rhetorics, right, which essentially claims that mechanics and rules of a game, the procedures, can in themselves hold argumentative meaning. Playing is how we kind of access these rhetorics, just as we read a book. But as play scholar Miguel Sicart once said, this becomes a bit reductive. So he says the assumption behind mainstream proceduralism is that the meaning of games is contained exclusively in the formal system of the game. What players do is to reconfigure the meanings embedded in the rules defined by the players. So playing becomes accepting and learning from that system. Instead, Sicart argues games and rules and systems lend structure to play, but it's the play itself that is the center of meaning. After all, we can all play games in wildly different ways where the same mechanics or procedures can come to mean wildly different things. That's because for Sicart, play is better described as a way of relating to those rules and structures. That's not just for games, right? That's any musician here can probably recognize this, right? You have a certain structure, like a scale or a chord progression or a backing track, and you're playing within that structure. You play music as a way of relating to that structure, but it's your music that is, for, at least for you, the main point, the center of meaning. Somewhere in between those two positions is this theory of play. So a philosopher called Sitai Nguyen argues that games are the art of agency. Just as a painter paints with paint, a writer writes with words, a game designer designs with agency. Um, so Nguyen claims that games do have this kind of prescriptive frame, right? Games are not free play. There are certain things that you have to do in order to be able to consider yourself as playing a game. You know, yes, I can take a chessboard and tip it over and start eating the pieces, but we wouldn't say I'm playing chess, right? So in this way, games for Nguyen are a way of communicating agencies, inscribing and communicating them. And when I play a game, I'm entering into those kind of designed forms of agency for the duration. And that allows me to experience things in a different way, to relate to things differently, and so on. So that's where this then converges back with Sicart's view. It's not that the meaning is inscribed in the game as the object, it's that games offer this structure within which we play. But that there is something in that structure that's also meaningful for Nguyen. Um, we otherwise, you know, with games, we would otherwise have no foundation on which to talk about similar experiences if we're not playing the same game in that sense. So if we were to visualize this, I'd put it like this. And this is the Mytholudics cycle. Um, so game development draws on existing mythology. Um, the existing mythologies in society, and those are in some way inscribed into the game. And no matter what the game does with that myth, you know, reinforcing it or undermining it, for instance, its presence in the game is a kind of acknowledgement of it. Then we have what we just talked about, this separate step where the player plays the game and in doing so relates to the mythology of the game. And then we interpret it based on that. This orange arrow in the middle kind of indicates that we can actually skip the playing of the game and still produce interpretations of it. It might not be advisable, but people can and frequently do interpret games that they haven't played. Think about, you know, things like Grand Theft Auto controversies, right? A lot of those interpretations are produced by people who never touched the game. And then finally, the interpretations that we produce suffuse back into society, right? Maybe affecting how we see those myths or creating new ones or, you know, not doing very much at all. But this is the bit where the game maybe makes us feel or think a bit differently about things and, you know, maybe see the world slightly differently. So I want to turn to an example that many of us will be at least passingly familiar with. This is the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, released in 2011 by Bethesda. If you're not familiar, you get the gist from this screenshot, right? It's a role-playing fantasy game, very Norse-inspired game world that has you adventuring around and fighting dragons. You discover early on that you are the last Dragonborn, a prophesized hero on a quest to defeat the World Eater Alduin. So I'll walk you through a kind of brief mytholudic analysis of this, and we'll see where we get. And I want to focus on heroism and monstrosity in particular. So Skyrim revolves around this prophecy that sets up our hero and our main monster. So it has these kind of a bunch of when X happens, when Y happens, and then when the snow tower lies sundered, kingless, bleeding, the world eater wakes, and the wheel turns upon the last dragonborn. Now, part of a mytholudic analysis means abstracting some of these into more portable elements that we can then, compare elsewhere and find in other parts. So, um, this format and some of the terms here, like devil, are taken from Frogg's method, which is called mythic discourse analysis. So you can read more about that there if you're interested. And obviously, I'll go into more detail in the book as well. But from this, we can recognize a very basic prophetic structure. We have some kind of supernatural agent prophesying a great evil emerging and the great hero who will defeat it. So Alduin and the Dragonborn. And this already places the game within a very well-known tradition of fantasy and myth built on certain assumptions. So one is that there exist fundamental forces of good and evil and that there is a balance between them. There is a great evil, but there's also a great hero. And that hero is also an individual, which is an important point because what we also want to look for is what is not there, what it could have been but wasn't. So we wouldn't expect to see a prophecy of this kind end with the world eater wakes and the wheel turns upon collective action, mass organization, and the mobilization of the people of Skyrim, right? That seems a bit of a facetious point, but for Mytholudics, like I say, it's very much asking about what's not there that could have been. This is a world that hinges on the actions of a great individual. The second point that follows from that is that heroism is not aspirational, in the sense that one cannot become the hero, right? If you were born in Skyrim and you're not Dragonborn, you can forget about defeating Alduin and saving the world. So in this way, heroism is not something contingent on action, on what you do, but it's preordained. The inherent heroism This inherent heroism has important implications for how we understand Skyrim, I think. So it's well known for being an open world RPG that's very free. In fact, a common joke is that many players have played it for years and they have never seen the ending because they completely ignore the main quest and they just adventure around the world instead. This is a tension that Vlad Melnik brings up when he describes the game as a postmodern epic. What he means by that is that it retains the prophecy aspect of the epic, but it fuses it with a more modern, maybe even neoliberal tendency towards self-making. Players can become vampires or werewolves. They can worship and follow supposedly evil deities. They can get a spouse and a home. And many, many players do that instead of the main quest line. That alternate mode of play would put a playing of Skyrim something more in line with something like the myth of the American frontier, for example, right? A man and his wife claiming a plot of land, building this self-sustaining homestead. And going back to the fact that Skyrim is a game we play, we should notice that the last part of the structure doesn't actually happen until the very end of the main quest line. Because as we've said, for many people that never happens, right? So a better representation would be to say that while A, B, and C happen in every playthrough of Skyrim, D is what Frog calls an implicit and imminent motif. What that means is it's one that has not happened yet, but based on what has happened previously is expected to happen. And so can be treated as truth, because in this model of understanding the world, you would simply never have A, B, and C, and then not D. So this gives the game world this anchor of heroism, the suspension of epic heroism that Melnick talks about, remains heroic because of this. The hero is still the hero of prophecy, even when that prophecy is never fulfilled, because you know it will be fulfilled. So let's turn to the game's Norse influences and how those play out a bit more of kind of through mythology. So I'm not going to give you a kind of laundry list of all the things Skyrim draws from Norse mythology. It's obviously quite a lot, and it doesn't tell us very much. But what I'm interested in is to what end those influences are used. So just to take two main examples. The Draugr are described as undead Nordic warriors of Skyrim, among the most common foes in Skyrim's many crypts and catacombs. Clearly, these are influenced by Old Norse Draugr, which are usually translated into English as ghosts. Droga are spirits who rise from their burial mound and continue to pose a threat to the living. But we need to be careful here. The Icelandic folklorist Ármann Jakobsson warns us that just because some modern concepts use the same word as old or ancient ones doesn't mean that they are the same or that the comparison goes beyond the name at all. The scholar Penny de Biel argues that Skyrim's Draugr are a mixed picture in this regard. In some ways, like being tied to places of burial, they better preserve the Norse Draugr heritage than many other modern incarnations of them. But actually, they also owe much more in their depiction, appearance, and especially behavior to modern zombies than to Norse Draugr. This is typical of folkloric transfer between time and media. Certain key elements are maintained, but others are adapted for the affordances and limitations of the medium in question. So we can really see this in the kind of zombification of the Draugr. The game scholar Tanya Krasinska puts it well when she says that game zombies provide the ideal enemy. They are strong, relentless, and already dead. They look spectacularly horrific, and they invite the player to blow them away without guilt or second thought. This ties into a lot of arguments about the computational nature of game monsters, which is that video games are particularly well suited to zombies because they're mindless enemies. And if they're mindless enemies, then they're very, very easy to code behavior for, convincing behavior for, right? And de Biel argues that Skyrim's Draugr fulfill this role really nicely. Um, While each individual Draugr in an Old Norse context might be highly significant, with a rich backstory to be understood regarding how it died and why it haunts its burial ground, in Skyrim, Draugr are de-individualized and decontextualized. They're turned into a mindless zombie horde. So Skyrim's Draugr are neither just Old Norse Draugr, nor are they just a zombie? They're a kind of amalgamation of the two. It fuses Old Norse tradition with modern computational monsters. A second quick example, dragons, of course. So Skyrim dragons clearly take most influence from Celtic and Germanic dragons, in particular, not so much from Chinese dragons, for example. And they follow some typical Germanic constructions in particular. For example, as an omen of disaster. And they have a lot in common, actually, with Draugr in terms of, as Martin Arnold puts it, harrowing behaviors, arcane wisdom, and remote barrows, which are typically found in dramatic places, like this one. In traditions like the Germanic tradition of dragons, they are often positioned as the ultimate foe for the ultimate hero. You have Beowulf, Sigurd, George, right? These heroes are all partly iconic for the dragons that they slayed. So the game is clearly drawing on the role that dragons take in Old Norse sources in particular. But like with the Draugr, it's also updating and adapting them to fit the computational medium, and modern sensibilities and understandings. For example, the dragons here aren't coming to us directly kind of via Germanic sources. They're coming to us via Tolkien and then Dungeons and Dragons, right, which set the stage for the modern vision of fantasy dragon. That sets us up with certain expectations. There's also something strange about the in-game region of Skyrim and how that also adapts its outward Norse appearance. That is, it's both decidedly Neo-Norse, right? The Viking aesthetics, the snow, the fjords, the mountains, the Draugr, the dragons. But it's also presented as a region oppressed by the Empire, which has its core in Cyrodiil to the south. And indeed, one of the most prominent quest lines in the game is the ongoing Skyrim civil war, which is between the ethno-nationalist Nordic Stormcloaks and the multicultural Empire. This has led some to argue that Skyrim's depiction of Neo-Norseness is distinctly American. It claims both the sort of European, and especially white European, Viking heritage, as well as a victimhood born of questions of indigeneity and besiegement from an outside imperial force, which maybe has a little bit more in common with the War of Independence. And this plays into various ways of reading the game too. So Christian A. Biaccolo, he has this really interesting study of Skyrim's uptake within white supremacist communities. So basically, to put it bluntly, the far right love the Stormcloaks and they identify very strongly with them. They see them as an oppressed white minority against this globalist multicultural empire that seeks to outlaw their ways. That's not the only way that one can read them. It's just one that works for those who already have a white supremacist model for understanding um, the world. Hopefully, that's not the only way you can read them, because a lot of hopefully not white supremacists also kind of go down the Stormcloak route. Now we can put this we can put this in this form according to mythic discourse analysis, right? The Stormcloaks rebel against Empire. Now, we can abstract this in two ways depending on our interpretation of the conflict and how this conflict resonates with our own pre-existing model for understanding the world. It can either be the oppressed rebel against oppressor, but we might be more specific if we're a white supremacist. Ethno-nationalists rebel against multiculturalism. Maybe we see multiculturalism and oppressor as kind of equivalent units in this case. The white supremacist reading draws strongly on what Carl Steele describes as the heritage function of Vikings in America. Because the Vikings came to North America and then left again, Steele argues that white Americans use this as an origin for white victimhood. They can draw both on a sort of noble barbarity of Vikings, as well as narratives of embattlement, besiegement, and oppression in the context of a subjugated ethno-nationalist state. But the point overall is that there's enough ambiguity in this political storyline that its mythic elements can be reconfigured according to the player's own interpretation. And it puts some clear water between its Norse aesthetics and an actual representation of Norse or Viking politics and society, because of course the Vikings were usually the ones doing the invading and the traveling, not the ones subjugated by an encroaching empire so much. So, what can we take from this? For me, one of the key parts is how heroism is used as a fulcrum to balance between the game's famous open-endedness and free choice, but also the inevitability and inherency of fantastical prophecy. The prophecy gives us a minimal heroic construction that is really very, very bare bones. There's really only three essential features of a Dragonborn, right? They will kill Alduin, they can absorb dragon souls, and they can use dragon shouts. And this allows the player to fill in all of those other gaps. The Dragonborn can be of any gender, race, body type, and specialize in any form of combat that the game allows. They can join any faction, even ones that oppose one another. And this shows us just how minimal a hero can be when their heroism is inherent and preordained. They don't need to be or do anything else to be the hero. And this acts as an anchor for us to layer our own interpretations and playthroughs on top. The form of the events in the game does not change, right? Even the two Civil War quest lines run in exactly the same way, but for opposing sides. If you lay it out in those kind of abstracted mytholudic terms, both the Stormcloak and the Imperial quest lines are the same quest line. You just swap out who is being killed and who is being protected and so on. And ironically, I think this strengthens the prophetic nature of the heroism in this game. Because if the Dragonborn is still the hero, no matter whether they help the Stormcloaks or the Imperials, whether they join the Thieves Guild or the Mages Guild, whether they're a werewolf or a vampire, then the preordination of the heroism must be remarkably strong. Within the game world, this means that heroism is not contingent on current events in Skyrim, but it's pre-contextual. It exists before any historical or political context, and so it's constructed as built into the very fabric of the game world's reality. So that was a very quick whiz through kind of mytholudic analysis of Skyrim. I have another example, but I don't think I have time for it really. I can basically skim it, but the idea of Call of Duty, another series that we should all be passingly familiar with, right? And I'm really interested in the idea of the war hero here. Is Call of Duty critical at all about the notion of heroism in war? Right? My suspicion is that it's not, but I'm really interested in these kind of obvious examples in some way. Like, how do they construct their just the way it is-ness? So it creates the kind of hero victim concept that becomes really important here, right? So soldiers bond with each other on the level of the squad. Higher ups like officials and politicians fail, betray or abandon the squad, and then the squad and one individual in particular go above and beyond for their comrades and or innocence. So you can see this in things like Call of Duty World War II's heroic actions mechanic, which are bonus events that occur during a mission where to successfully complete it, you have to react to the situation, right? So that can be quickly taking out an enemy who's just about to kill your captured squad mate. And these all really focus on the squad. But they can, for example, also include not shooting an enemy who has surrendered. And this implies something as well about this construction, right? It's acknowledging that your opposing soldiers are in a similar situation to you. They are ordered around by higher ups whose political decisions they had no part in. And the heroism is about recognizing shared humanity in spite of the hellish circumstances. Um, yeah, so then I also have some fun stuff about the kind of military techno fetishism. Um, so I'd be very happy to talk about that if you want to ask about it, but I don't have time to go into it just now, I'm afraid. I'm probably also going a bit slower because of my voice. Oh, and then a kind of, yeah, a fun anecdote is like this. I think a really clear example where a lot of these ideas come to the fore is in the cancellation of Call of Duty Vietnam. So this was in development in the early 2010s before it got cancelled, and it's a really revealing and quite funny reason why it was cancelled. So in an interview, the then CEO of the studio, Glenn Schofield, said this. He said, we found out as we were researching it as well, all around the world, it's actually known as America's War, not Vietnam's. We were the only ones that called it the Vietnam War. It's kind of unpopular, and we didn't really understand the marketing aspect of that. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that, there are games that go to Vietnam, right, and make a game about Vietnam War. Call of Duty can't do that because of its particular construction of the hero of war. It doesn't work with it um, because the cause has to be either seen as just or um, they have to yeah be betrayed and ordered around by their higher ups. But basically, Vietnam doesn't quite work with the kind of hero victim because we don't really see them as victims so much. Yeah. And then the last point about that is that the US military, why does all of this matter? Right. That's what I'm getting at here. Why do these kinds of depictions matter? It's because the US military love Call of Duty. They absolutely love it, and they're not at all secretive about it. So these are just the headlines on a front page of a Google search. The terms Call of Duty US military. Both parties are very happy to endorse each other and work together very closely. There are official Call of Duty tournaments held between teams in the UK and US militaries. They work with military advisors. There are special deals, discounts, sponsorships, and so on and so on. And the point to all of this is that the US military would not be doing this if they did not believe Call of Duty to be beneficial to them. And so I think that that's then important to see in exactly what ways this is being done throughout the series, and kind of to untangle that and see why is it that the U.S. military love it? Does that mean we should not love it? Sorry for that kind of violent reduction, but yeah, like I say, feel free to ask me more about that or get the book. Um, but I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of how this kind of analysis works, right? Um, it is a little bit messy, but I think that's fine because I think it's all about finding these disconnected elements and you put them in kind of constellations with each other, uh, orbiting some kind of maybe central meaning. So, like war heroism in Call of Duty, or like this idea of prophecy and prophetic heroism in Skyrim. All these different elements orbit it, and they are affected by the gravity of it in this sense. I think this is a nice metaphor for understanding it. This isn't about narrativizing them and explaining the game, right? And that's why I think we have to stay with the mess and the disconnectedness of meaning making as it occurs and as we experience the game. Um, And I think this can be usefully stressed by going back to this idea of models, myths as models for understanding the world and things in it, and games as kind of emulated models of worlds, which are then structured in certain ways. So let's return again to the idea of sound and music. In Western music, we typically use the 12 tone division of the octave. There's no real reason why we divide it into 12s, or why we distinguish them like this. It's just that working with the whole of sound itself is a little bit overwhelming. So musicians found a model for understanding sound that works pretty well. All sorts of sonic and mathematical things come together then to form supplementary models like the circle of fifths here, with which we can make pretty reliably, we can make decent music, or maybe even great music, while being sufficiently varied. And crucially, it allows for prediction. A model allows for prediction. Musicians who know their theory can generate musical ideas before they play a single note. We know that certain progressions and combinations and chords have certain kind of cultural qualities to them. And like myth, this is tautological, this is reciprocal. Those chords and progressions and notes have those meanings in part because we're so used to them and because centuries of music has used them in those particular ways. Myth works tautologically. This is something that Roland Barthes tells us. It justifies itself cyclically, and so too does music in this way. And so it's not I think it's not much of a surprise that a lot of the writing about myth uses musical analogies. The great literary scholar Northrop Frye is perhaps the best example of this. He borrows terms like keys, rhythm, the circle of fifths, and parallels. For him, music theory is to sound as mythical structures are to story. For me, I think it goes further than story. Myth is a model that we place over the world to make sense of it and to guide our actions within it. And so I think we can think of games as models for play in this way. They reduce play from the all-encompassing, overwhelming notion of free play into a workable set of rules, affordances, systems, and relations which structure but don't wholly railroad it. So I think of Mytholudics as a framework for considering both of those aspects together, the confluence between the guide rails and restrictions and affordances and constitutive elements, but also the way that we play within and play with those structures. Mytholudics, I think, can help to unpick the way that those games are organized, and it accounts for the different ways that we can play it. It's about the unspoken premises that govern the ways in which things in the game are put into relation with one another. What does the model of reality within the game world encourage us to predict? How does it make us approach tasks? And how do those then feed back potentially into society and influence the games that come next? If we want to apply this to world building, we simply flip the order, right? We start with those portable abstract motifs that we would like to underpin our world. Um, and we already do this with world building to some extent, but this offers a way of codifying that, right? So instead of a kind of game of telephone where in meetings and design documents you're trying to get across to someone what is important in this world, you can express it in these abstract portable terms. Um, let's say we wanted to make a game that focuses on the idea of equitable exchange, right? It's all about fairness and paying your debts, and maybe explores some of the problems that come with that obsession of debt. We'd probably have a motif like this, you or someone else gives an object of worth and they give something of equal worth back. We could think about this as a classic item bartering, right? Giving a jewel and getting another kind of jewel of equal worth in return. Or like a sword traded for a spear of equal worth. But we could extrapolate it into dialogue between characters and the way that people in this society talk, like this idea that a compliment must always be repaid with one of equal worth. Or that justice is dealt by an eye for an eye. Already from one abstract motif, we get a little sense of what this world and society is like. Maybe that's one faction within the game world, maybe that's the whole society you experience, but it will percolate into gameplay mechanics like trading and bartering and what you're allowed to do to other characters and so on. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in reading more about my approach, I have two recommendations for you. The first and most important is my book, which is out now. It can be all yours for the low price of 7 million euros or something. the biggest offer it's gone on is 40%, which you can see here. I don't think it's on that now. But yeah, it does go on to offer at some point. But yeah, don't buy my book. But please request it in your libraries and make them buy it if you're interested. And yeah, there may be ways to get your hands on PDFs, but yeah, I couldn't say anything about that. If you want to try before you buy, I do have an open access article that applies this framework to the From Software's Souls games, so you can see it in action a little bit. Um, and if nothing else interested you here, then I can offer you a picture of my cat, Winston, and my sincere thanks for listening. So thank you very much.